All right, let's pick up where we left off. I want to talk right now about locking things, arranging things in terms of sending them backwards and forwards in the depth field inside of Illustrator, and also grouping and ungrouping. Okay, so let me just get rid of these, and I'm going to kind of go back to at least some semblance of what I had before. I'm going to kind of start from here. And something else that I also, before I show you that I, want to mention really quickly is that if you find that your stuff is kind of wanting to snap to a spot, like if you try to take something, move it, and then it just all of a sudden like snaps to something, let me just show you where you can turn that off. Later I'm going to show you how to turn it on and do stuff with grids, but right now let's just be just a little bit more organic with what we're doing. I don't want that extra constraint on you. But if that happens, you can go up here to view and you can take off any of the snap stuff. So snap to grid, snap to pixel, snap to point. If you see a check mark next to it, that's why it's snapping to stuff. And if you click it, it'll deselect it. Okay. So I just want to mention that. Now, the other thing that I didn't really mention before is that let's say that we've got our, I'm going to duplicate this box real quick. I want to show you a really quick thing without using a grid. Okay, you can sort of strategize on basic geometry on making things even, because you might have gotten up here and said, well, I'm sort of eyeballing, this, and we'll talk about alignment and all that later. I don't want to get into that right now. But if you were to take this, for instance, and let's say that you did a shift option and you wanted to drag that over. Because you're dragging it over, you could kind of look at the space in between those two objects and kind of go, okay, that's about right. That's about how close I'd want them. Well, now what you could do, instead of having to like, do another shift option and kind of like ballpark it again, what you could do instead, like I showed you before, is you could take this and you could use the reflect tool or the rotational tool or whatever, and you could duplicate it, but you could duplicate it in a really controlled way. So if I go over here to, let's just do the rotational tool for instance, and I double click it, all right, and see it gives me the mirror image. If I say copy, now I've got a solid grid, and the arrangement is absolutely perfect because it's doing it with geometry, like perfect mathematical geometry. Okay, so that's just something to consider if you are trying to get something that is kind of like a perfect grid or a place to start or whatever. So like if I were to say forget that and let's just start from this point, we could do that, right? I could come up here and say, all right, well, I want this guy to be bigger, and I'm going to draw it out, not, I'm going to lift off of option, I'm going to draw it out not from the center, but, from someplace out here. Maybe, I could look at doing it somewhere in this ballpark, right? And then maybe this guy then could end up being, I don't know, even larger, so that I start to get this semblance of, and I could make that one smaller, the semblance of arrangement there, right? And you can start to play with scale, but then I still have this integrated structure in between that keeps them separated. And then, of course, I would need to make a fifth square somehow. And you can play with all these. That's why the iterative process is so important, because a lot of times you're not necessarily going to see right off the bat what's really going to work for you the best. And then, like if you wanted these to actually be kind of perfect relationships with one another, actually, let's look at this again, and we can say that this is 0.85, right? Well, if I wanted to change that, excuse me, and I wanted to shift scale it down, right? You could figure out what half of that is, or the other thing that you could do is you could come over here to the scale tool. Let's double click that, and where it says uniform, like I could choose exactly 50% here. Let's do 50%, and then I'm going to do copy. All right, and so it made it smaller, but what's nice about this, I'm actually going to take off the stroke. In fact, I'm going to select all of these things, and I'm going to remove the stroke. So if I select here where it's got the little stroke icon, I'm going to, well, it's not doing it for me here. Let's choose something, and then let's take it off there. All right, so now none of them have stroke. And then if I know that box is in the center, so if I select it, what I can actually do is I can, so that I can see where this registration is, I can move this box and I'm going to hold down shift to constrain it, and I'm going to put it right exactly in the same spot. And then what's cool about Illustrator is that you can actually blow stuff up to see how close something actually is to where it's supposed to be. So it's actually not perfectly in the corner. So there, now it is pretty much, right? So I can zoom back out, and then if I wanted, I could either get rid of this bigger box or I could just move it, scale out actually really quickly. So I'm going to take this bigger box and I'm going to hold down shift and just get it out of the way. So you can see that the smaller one is there, and if I zoom out, now you can see that I've got that smaller one right there, and it's exactly 50% of this box, which is pretty cool because these two were the same size. And you could keep doing that, like if you wanted this one and this one to have that same relationship where they just keep getting, you know, incrementally bigger by 50%, you could do that. So you can mess around with the math and stuff like really easily. And you know, the other thing too is, let's say that we're going to deal with some overlapping shapes at this point. First of all, let's see what happens if we make this go off the picture plane, like it gets bigger, right? So that it seems like we've got something that's sort of ominous here in the corner. Now, if I wanted to take this whole thing, all right, let me move this out of the way for a minute. I could take this whole section if I wanted and see what happens if I do a rotational axis, and I'm going to shift, right, and see what happens when I change the whole rotational axis of this piece, and I'm going to pull it over a little bit at a time, and then you can see like what happens as the, you know, what is it going to look like when it's got pieces coming off of the picture plane, and so on and so on. And then, you know, this guy, maybe you would want this one to intersect. So if we shift and make it a lot bigger and then move it around, you know, you could constrain it. Let's see, let's try this and see what happens. I'm just sort of messing around right now, okay? I'm not, and this is exactly kind of the way that I want you to start thinking, is see what happens if you just start fooling around with these objects and stuff, okay? You know, what happens when you've got something that does something like that, you know? You've got these objects that start to exit the plane and so on, and maybe this one can even, you know, what happens whenever this, I don't know, right? And so you can just start to sort of mess around with stuff like that. And then if you have an instance where, like, you want this one, for instance, maybe this one you do want to have a stroke. So let's add a stroke now on this one. And let's take a look and make sure that it's, see, this one is on the inside, so what's going to end up happening is that these aren't going to look like they're in alignment, right? And so what you might actually want for, in this case, is you might want this stroke to be on the outside of the box so that these alignments look right. So you could come over here now to, while you have this selected, come over to stroke, and you can change this so that it's on the outside, so that now these look like they all line up properly. And you can see that the stroke over here is behaving differently on top of this object. And so I could also now increase the stroke significantly, right? And you want to make sure that you don't increase it so much that it starts to make this box look smaller, right? And if it's on the top, and let's just say that we did, and let's say that you want it to be a really big stroke, you also might want to make sure that it stays within the same amount of space as this, right? So if you don't know what this distance is, you could kind of play around with it until you get it right. But the other thing that you could do is, like, let's just, for right now, let's make it really big, and then we can kind of come back later and figure it out by taking these two objects right here, and oops, I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to select that. Now I've got two objects selected, and you can see that the stroke of this one is overlapping because it's on top. What we need to do is send that to the back. So if we can go up here to object and arrange, and we can actually, what we want to do is send these two to the very front. So we can go object, arrange, and we'll say bring to front. All right, and so now they came up and they're literally on top of this one in the layer stacking order, if you were to look here. And if you wanted to give these different boxes names so that they're easier to recognize inside of your artboard layer panel, you could. All right, and so now what you can do is start to make changes you know, where you can see the relationship, for instance, of this stroke to this line here. And so let's go back to the stroke of this object. I'm going to select that object and now go to stroke, and I'm going to lower the stroke a little bit. And so you could, if you wanted to draw a line so that you know that it's lining up, you could do that. That's an option. But you would need to get rid of that line. So for instance, if I wanted to take my line tool, which is over here somewhere. Oops, yeah, it was underneath my polar grid tool. I don't want that. I want my line segment tool. Let me close this. I didn't mean for that to pop up. Okay, so if you wanted, what you could do is you could take like a line tool, and you could, I know I have it on a 45-degree axis, so I'm going to draw a line like this, right? And I'm going to get rid of the stroke. So I'm going to select the stroke here and hit the transparency tool. And then you can see right off the bat that this is not perfectly in line. And if that matters to you, you can fix it by adjusting the stroke of this this other object if you want. And as soon as I deselect this line, it's going to disappear. So you could give it a very, very small stroke. Here, I'm going to click the foreground and get rid of the foreground. I'll go to this little stroke tool, and over here in the stroke area, let's make it like 0.1 or something like that. And then it's a lot thinner, and it's easier for me to keep track of it. Okay, and I could also make it like a bright color if I wanted, like, you know, yellow or something like that, so that it's easier for me to see it whenever I'm zoomed out. And then, you know, you can adjust by taking your selection tool, click this object, right? I've got this big one selected, you can see here by the corner. And then I'm going to blow it up, right? And then you could start messing around to make sure that the stroke is going to line up okay with the way that this object is, right? And so let's see, let's go over here, and we're going to make the stroke slightly less. Let's do like 4.7. And then that's a little too much, so like maybe 0.85 or something like that. Let's try that. And that is probably a pretty good ballpark, right? That's probably going to be fine. I'm going to select that line and just delete it. And you can see now that the relationship of these intersections actually look pretty good. Now the other thing too that you might look at when you see this is you might go, okay, well, I kind of don't like the weird space that's there. You've got all these really nice spaces that have the same amount of distance. So you could go, if you wanted, I'm going to hold down shift so it stays square. You could do something like that, and it comes pretty close to the same distance if you wanted to think of it as the same distance. But then, you know, something that you might start to think about is it's going up underneath here, but because of the way that I have it set, you can see that this object, this other object, has a stroke and it's covering it up. So it's actually working pretty well. So those are some of the things that you can play with in terms of like having foreground and background and things like that, is that you've got this object, well, you have to choose an object. You have to object menu and arrange, and you can put things forward, backward. You can also send something all the way to the back or all the way to the front. And then you have these little shortcuts with the square bracket keys. So it'd be Command or Control, open square bracket to bring to the very front, and so on. You can look at these different options if you want to use shortcuts. Okay, so now let's say that you want to be able to just click and drag like that, and you want to grab stuff really easily and quickly, but you don't want to select maybe a certain object. Like maybe, for instance, I don't want to select these two objects, okay? For whatever reason, let's say I don't want to select those. What I can do is I can select those here, and I can, in my layer panel, I can choose to lock those. First of all, I need to make sure that's the right one. I'm going to lock that. Let's make sure that's the right one, and I'm going to lock that. And so now when I click and drag, or if I do a select all, Command A, anything that's not locked is not going to be anything that is not locked is going to be selected, right? And so now I can manipulate these as necessary. If I wanted to, you know, move these away or something like that, I could. I'm going to undo that, and so on, right? I could keep playing around with this. Um, the other thing that you might want to consider is there's also up here object and you've got lock, and you can say lock selection. This does something a little bit different. It's not just locking it here. If you just want to lock it to the screen really quick so that you can't select it, you can do that as well. And once you start locking things, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky because then to unlock it you have to come and do unlock all unless you know exactly what the thing is that's locked. So but that's how you can lock and unlock things so that you don't accidentally select and change them. And the other thing I wanted to show you really quickly is I want to show you how to group things. So this would be another good example. See how I have these two objects down here locked? Well, if I want to be able to select these two things and then just go to Object Group, right? Or I can do Command or Control G for grouping. Then that way now everything that I do to this set, it's going to automatically, when I click on it, it selects the entire group. It doesn't just select individual pieces. And when I do something to it, it automatically wants to make everything in the group bigger. So let's say that I liked this organization a lot and I want to, let's say I'm going to unlock these. Let's say I want to copy this. Oops, not cut it. Undo that. Let's copy it with Command or Control C. You can also go up here to Edit Copy. And let's say for a moment that I want to, I'm going to lock my entire artboard 1 so I don't accidentally do anything to it. I'm going to come up here to artboard 2, unlock it, and let's just say I don't like these squares right now and I want to go over here to this artboard and I can do edit, paste in place, and it puts it in this artboard exactly in the same way. And so now I can basically have a second iteration without messing up this original one. Okay, so I can come here and everything else is locked, so that's good. I can come here now and I can choose if I want to lock these. I can. I might not like this one so much anymore. Like I want to maybe change that. So maybe this one is doing, oops, see, and maybe I want that one to stay locked, right? So I can come over here and I can make sure that's the right one and I can lock that one so I don't accidentally mess it up whenever I want to grab that and move it around. And so there's all these different things that you can do here, and like let's say that I want that one, I'm going to nudge it with my nudge keys, my arrow keys, so that the center point is at the bottom of this, and then you know I can see what that looks like and how it's different. The other thing I can do too is like I can take it with hold the corner, shift and option, and I can make it smaller from the center like that, and you know maybe that's something that I want. I don't know, right? And then I could take this object and I could say object arrange bring to front, right? And so now it's on top of this one, and maybe maybe I do need to make it a little bit bigger. And oh, the other thing too is because I did have that center point there, and because of the way that the stroke is, it's never I'm going to undo that. It's never going to overlap these edges, so I need to actually move it up so that at least covers the stroke line so that it looks like it's a single object, if that's in fact my intention, to make these things look like they're a single unit, right? And so now at this point I could come and do shift option and scale, and maybe you know maybe that's something that I want. I don't know, right? I'm just kind of messing around with this, okay? And so it gives you some ideas about how you can adjust these things and then start to do things that are iterative. Now that this is a group, because I duplicated the whole group, now I can come and you know scale this up in a different way. I can move it back down here, right? I can, so anyway, I can do a lot of different things to kind of play around. I don't necessarily like this, but you can see that it gives me some different options, and then right now we're not dealing with what happens using tools like the Pathfinder or Paint Bucket. If you know how to use those are things that we're going to use in the refinement stage. So if you can avoid doing some of that stuff, that would be good, because once you do that stuff, once you use like the Paint Bucket tool, it becomes a lot harder to undo it. Okay, and once you use the Pathfinder and you save your changes and you close your file, that's what you've got. You've got a solid new object now. Okay, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But if you are the person in the class who is like, Illustrator Pro, right? And you're like jumping the gun and going way ahead, then you may regret it later. So I just want to let you know that you should try to keep your objects right now at this phase at least as separate objects. And if you really want to see what something looks like, with a stroke so that you can see the overlap and intersection, go ahead and use strokes and things like that, but don't do actual true intersections with the Pathfinder or with the paint bucket. All right, so the other thing that I want to show you really quickly, actually I really do hate that square there, so I'm going to just delete it. Okay, and I'm going to select this group, and let's see if I move that, I don't know, over or something. There's some different options that we have, but maybe what I would want to do is I want to duplicate this box right here and maybe have it here, but the problem is like I keep selecting it and it's the whole group. Well, what you can do is you can double click this, and what it does, you notice up here, is it sends it into what's called isolation mode, meaning that it now allows me to individually select the component objects within a group, and it sort of does like this opacity level on top of everything else that's outside of the group. All right, so if you see something like this and you're not sure what just happened, you probably went into isolation mode, and the way to know for sure is that you look up here and it'll show you like a breadcrumb trail of all of the things that you're inside of, because you can have groups within groups within groups, just so you know. All right, so it can be easy sometimes to get lost. So when you double click on something that's a group, it's going to put you in the group, and if you have other subgroups, you're going to have to double click to get inside of those groups. Right, and then to get out of this, you can just come somewhere outside of it and double click, and it puts you back into the normal mode. So anyway, I want to actually go into isolation mode, right? And I can just change this, or not change it, but I can copy this. So I'm going to do a duplication where I do click and hold and then shift and then option, because I want to constrain it, and I want to maybe do something like that, right? And then maybe what I'll do here is I want to move it. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let me zoom this in a little bit so I can get a better feel for what I'm grabbing. And then I'm going to click and just hold shift. I'm not duplicating it this time. And I want to, let's say, make it look like it's coming out of the corner, sort of, right? And I might be a little bit happier with something like this, right? And then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes, right? And I'm still not crazy about this one right here. And I might want to go and move that box. Let's go back to our layers. I'm going to unlock that. And then maybe what's going to happen, I don't know. Let's just move it somewhere else and let's see what happens. Maybe now is the right time on this particular iteration to get rid of that stroke. So I can come up here and tell it 0 stroke, or, excuse me, I could come here and tell it that it's an invisible stroke. We can come here and you could, still try to have some sort of arrangement like that. Right, so it's kind of up to you how you want to do this, and then I could, I could keep on playing around with this. I can pull it this direction so that it gets bigger and bigger like that, and then I can move it off to the edge like this if I want to keep these things. Right, and so you could play with the different arrangements of squares, and you'll see that they start to bleed into one another, and that's one of the reasons the artboards, I told you to keep them sort of far apart. But if you get into something that's this big, the other last thing I want to show you really quickly is how you can make a clipping mask. So I'm going to go over here to my layers just so we can see what we've got right here. And this is where you might want to actually label everything. And if I really liked this arrangement, what I might do, there's some different ways I could do this. What I might do is I'm going to open up this group. I'm going to take this object and I'm going to put it inside of this group. All right, and so now everything is inside of that group, which is kind of good. So now the next object that I make inside of this artboard is not going to be inside of that group. So what I want to do is I want to take my rectangle tool, okay, and I want to, inside of the correct artboard, all right, I want to draw something that is basically the size of the artboard. I want to constrain the proportions, and then right now it's just a big black box. You could switch the foreground and stroke if you wanted to. It really doesn't matter. You can also even choose to have no stroke if you want. It's just going to be an object, and it's going to be used to create a clipping path. And so what I can do with this now is to make sure that it's exactly the right size that it needs to be, I can go to transform. I can either, if it's not showing, I can click here to transform, and then I can make sure that it's actually the correct size. And remember, we had 7 by 7 inches. So if we do 7 by 7, and then the other thing too is that you'll see that it's like right on the edge of the axis, and if you were to zoom in, you'll see that it's actually really not in line with where it's supposed to be. So if we, I bet you anything that if we change this to 17, yep, and we change this to 7, right? It snaps right to the actual thing. The other thing, this is where if you wanted, you could go up to view and you could turn snap to grid. And if you did snap to grid, then it would have snapped to the actual artboard. Okay, just so you know. So now we've got this object that is sitting on top, and if we look at our artboard, you'll see that it's got artboard, and then it's got rectangle, and then it's got our group. You could call this clipping. You could call it clip or something like that, so that you know what it's intended to be. And then now if I take my selection tool, I can select all of these things, right? And I've got nothing locked, which is good. You can double check that nothing is locked, because then it wouldn't get clipped. And then I want to go up here to say object, and then say clipping mask, make. And you see that it's also got a shortcut of Command or Control number 7. All right, and so I just made a clipping mask. And so those objects are still inside of there, but they have been clipped. All right, so if I wanted to double click this, you see that it goes into isolation mode, right? And I'm over here in isolation mode in my layers. All right, and then it shows me that I've got this clipping mask and so on. And if I double click again, it goes down into the isolation mode group, okay? And I'm going to double click out here. I just want to show you how that works. And then the thing that's nice about this is that if I wanted to, what if I don't like the way that this is interacting with that edge because it's vibrating too much visually? If I double click here, I go into the first isolation mode, and you see up here it says clip group. I can double click again, and now I've got the whole group right here, okay? So I can choose if I want to move individual pieces, or I can go back to clip group and I can move the whole group that's inside of the clipping group. And let's say that I wanted to do that with it, okay? And it's still inside of the clipping mask, and the clipping mask itself did not move, which is good. And the other thing is, if I, think that maybe it would look even better, I could come and I could make it look like it's coming like out of this axis. That's an option. Or I could make it look like, this is coming right out of that axis. So these are some of the things that you can think about as you're doing this stuff. You could also look at this and say, all right, well, maybe I still don't like the way that this is coming off the edge. And so you could, if you wanted, you could take this corner on this one object and you could scale it down so that it's a lot smaller, right? And then see how that looks and see if you like it, right? So anyway, there are all these different things that you can do, and I want you to play around with all your different iterations. This is going to be a really important phase. Obviously, we still have a refinement phase, but in the refinement phase, you're going to be choosing the best ones of what you do here, so make sure you've got a good lot to choose from, okay? All right, that's the end of the demo, and you can move on.